So I just moved to the University of Iowa about 2.5 years ago after finishing up a postdoc, and I have a lab in the Department of Psychiatry. And it's kind of an interesting place for me to be because my PhD is in computer science, and I'm in the Department of Psychiatry, which is kind of an unusual constellation of things. But the reason, I think you'll see in just a minute, we generate a lot of terabytes of data. We do a lot of whole genome sequencing, we do RNA sequencing, we do other kinds of sequencing, and that ends up generating a ton of data. And we do a lot of programming to analyze that data, and we do a lot of statistics to kind of comprehend what that data is saying and what kind of information and knowledge we can extract from that data. Now, one of our goals that we have is to better understand the genetic basis of language ability. And specifically, we focus on language impairment. And language impairment, and there's a kind of language impairment that's alternately called developmental language impairment or specific language impairment. This is something that actually affects a lot of people. It affects 7% of the population. And about 40% of those have co-occurring ADHD. And this, if you can think about an impairment in your ability to communicate, a lot of people with specific language impairment kind of describe it as your first language being kind of like trying to speak a foreign language, but it's your first language. And just imagine that amount of exertion and that amount of effort going into speaking your first language. That's kind of what a lot of these people are experiencing. And so you could understand how that would have major consequences for your employment if your boss can't understand you and you can't really understand what's expected of you from your boss. That has all sorts of implications for social opportunities and being able to communicate with your friends and with your family and your peers. And also, obviously, for educational attainment. If you're sitting in a classroom and you don't understand you have a hard time comprehending what's being presented to you, then it's going to be very difficult to work yourself through the educational system. But there's good news, and that is that the earlier that you can intervene, you'll have better outcomes. So the problem with language, though, is that it's something that doesn't emerge until it develops starting around a year to 3 and into 5, and it takes a while to really know whether or not a child definitely has a problem with language, and often by then it can be too late to really intervene in a really meaningful way. And so the hope for genetics and language is that genetics predates all manifestation of language, right? So we know before a child is born, we can sequence a child's whole genome before they're born from DNA that's floating around in the mother's blood, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. And so the idea is that someday down the road, we'll have a better understanding of how genetics influence language, and then that will help us to tailor interventions to specific genetic deficits in language so that we can anticipate it before it's a problem, and that we can work to enrich that child's experience in their environment so that they can have the best possible outcome. Right, so again, genetics is going to be the early. There are many different kinds of risk factors for language ability, and I want to emphasize that, but genetics is the one that is by far the earliest, and family history, of course. So I want to back up a little bit. That's kind of our motivation, but I want to back up and ask the question of why is human communication unique? Because the fact that animals communicate, and even other, we were talking around dinner last night about whether or not plants can be said to communicate with each other. There are definitely chemical cues that plants can send to one another, but certainly within the animal kingdom, there's a lot of examples of communication. So dolphins whistle and click and squeak and have communication that way, and songbirds have songs that have information payload and encoded in them, and bees even have characteristic dances that they do that communicate some basic things, and of course chimps and lots of other kinds of animals can do communication. So it's not communication that's unique. But what's unique about human communication is that it's open-ended, right? All these other examples have a very kind of fixed vocabulary of concepts that they communicate with one another, but human communication is entirely open-ended. We will always be writing new books that are communicating new ideas and new emotions and new feelings and new concepts, and we have the basic ingredients to mix and match to express really any idea that you can conceive of. And another thing about human communication is that it's layered and hierarchical. It's not just kind of this one-dimensional thing where we have these very basic utterances, we grunt in this way or that way, and we communicate certain things. But there's lots of layers with very basic stuff on the bottom and very nuanced stuff on the top, very sophisticated and advanced. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a minute. Okay, so human language is unique. So what are some of the characteristics of human language? So I'm going to talk just a little bit. This part doesn't really have much to do with genetics, but I think it's important to understand how complicated this is. So human language, as I said, is kind of hierarchical in their basic levels. If you want to think about this in terms of like subatomic particles and like neutrons and protons and electrons, and then those come together to make atoms, which is kind of another level of the hierarchy. And then atoms come together to make molecules, and that's another layer of the hierarchy. It's the same kind of thing with language. So there are these subatomic particles that are called phonemes, and then those make up morphemes, and you put morphemes together and you have rules of syntax. So what are phonemes? Phonemes are individual sounds, and this is important, that by themselves have no meaning. So you can, this is kind of, I admit, a little bit disturbing of a depiction here, but I'm not sure if you're modeling something why you don't make the teeth a little bit more idealized, but but anyway, this is kind of a catalog of some of the basic sounds that humans can make by articulating the lips and the mouth in different ways. And the interesting thing is that there are clusters of neurons in the auditory cortex that are devoted to firing when they hear these different phonemes. And these can be combined into morphemes. Morphemes are arrangements of phonemes, and this is where meaning starts to come out. So where phonemes by themselves don't have meaning, morphemes have meaning. So you can have prefixes like un and dis and trans. You have roots that by themselves are kind of standalone, and they communicate an idea by themselves. Sportsman, agree, continent, and then suffixes like, able, and all. So you could put these together into unsportsmanlike or disagreeable or transcontinental. And so this kind of gives you an idea of how human language is open-ended, because you can mix and match almost anything. And if you notice at the end of the year, journalism outlets will kind of talk about what the new words of that year were that were kind of characteristic of the time. And so there's always new words coming out. And so that's emphasizing, again, the innumerable new combinations that can come about with human communication. And then, of course, there's syntax, where when I was preparing this talk, I think the last time I saw a sentence diagram was back in, I don't know, 5th or 6th grade or something, but I was glad to be rid of it. But this shows you kind of the complicated rules that go into syntax, in arranging morphemes and words into phrases and sentences, and then those you start to get these emergent ideas and feelings and emotions and information in there. But even when you get that far in communicating the raw information, there's still a lot more in human communication on top of that. So the meaning of a sentence can't be determined only by the words that are in there. And so it's also how it's said that's important. And one of the ways that this is expressed is in intonation. And I'll give you an example of what that's like from a clip from Seinfeld, where Jerry was not invited to a party, and he wants to know why, or whether it was a mistake, or whether he was kind of on purpose not invited to the party. And so he's kind of getting a little bit of intelligence from his friend Elaine.
So, Jerome, I did a little snooping around for you.
Oh, what'd you find out, Lois?
Well, I talked to Tim Watley.
Yeah?
And I asked him, should Jerry bring anything?
Subtle.
And he said, why would Jerry bring anything?
All right, but let me ask you this question.
What?
Which word did he emphasize? Did he say, why would Jerry bring anything? Or, why would Jerry bring anything? Did he emphasize Jerry or bring?
I think he emphasized would.
Right, so this is I love this example because it perfectly communicates the fact that it was the same sentence all along, and yet the understood meaning would be very different depending on what words were emphasized in there. And so to make that a little bit more concrete, I want to present this sentence to you. He's not flying to Paris tomorrow. Okay? And I'm going to go through and we're going to emphasize each different word to see that the meaning of it changes by the word that's emphasized. So he's not flying to Paris tomorrow. 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 He's not flying to Paris tomorrow, right? So you can see it's exactly the same words every single time, but depending on the words that are emphasized, it can have an entirely different meaning. And I wanted to bring this up because this is something that people with specific language impairment very often have a problem with. Sometimes, depending on what kind of language impairment they don't have a problem understanding what the words are that you're saying, but the meaning can be completely lost on them. And you can envision how that might have some negative social consequences if you completely lack the ability to read into the meaning of what people are saying and you just take things at face value. So of course, this all goes a lot farther, and there's another level of it that you could call sarcasm, where you're communicating one thing, but it's understood that you mean either entirely the opposite or just completely not that thing at all. And so I want to share just another clip from Seinfeld that gets at this sarcasm. Think about what is being communicated on the surface and what the intent is.
Yeah. Jerry, my hairdryer ruined the picture. I know I need another one or I can't get back into the Forbidden City.
Who is this?
Jerry!
Hello.
Jerry, I'm trapped under my desk. Steinbrenner's in the room. You gotta help me.
Who is this?
Jerry!
Hello?
Elaine, you gotta get back down to the dealer. Putty is screwing me on this car, which is yellow now.
Who is this?
Elaine!
I'm going, Jerry.
Yeah.
Jerry! The Japanese guys had sake in the hot tub. You gotta get them out of the drawers and get them down here, or I don't have a focus group to sell the pilot to Japanese TV.
Uncle Leo?
Jerry!
All right, I'll wake him up. Testy.
Okay, so that's a really good demonstration, again, of this. Human communication is incredibly complicated. And so the bottom line that I want to emphasize to you guys is that for human language, there's kind of a hardware side and there's a software side. So, and it requires both the software, which is kind of like the cultural programming, and the words that we learn. You know, if a human were raised in complete isolation with no contact with any other humans, of course they would not have the vocabulary and they wouldn't know the rules of how to communicate, right? They still have the hardware, but they don't have the software at all. But it also requires the hardware, which is the brain biology and the necessary complexity and horsepower of that brain to be able to use that software to great effect. And so the software is really demanding, and quirks in the hardware, which is what I'm going to be talking about right now, can change the overall user experience, okay? So what causes variation in human language ability? Well, one thing that's really important that I'm not going to talk about at all today is environment and opportunity. Education, right? Exposure to lots of words, and there's lots of studies on how reading to your children is really good for their language development for obvious reasons. I'm not going to talk about that, but another thing that can affect the hardware is injury and trauma, and I'm going to give you a few examples there just to show that that when you poke the brain in the wrong way, what you get out the other end is a change in that person's capacity for language. And then finally, genetics, which is going to be the rest of my talk, that's also a way that the hardware can be tweaked in ways that can either be good or it can be very negative. Okay, so I'm going to show a few examples of stroke and what happens there. So the first one is this condition called Wernicke's aphasia. And aphasia is just an impairment in your ability to communicate. So in this case, words, and you're going to notice this is a very interesting case, words come out effortlessly from this person. He has no trouble spewing out a lot of words. They don't make any sense at all. I want you to listen closely to what he's actually saying. And the reason they don't make sense is because his comprehension is almost completely gone, and to the point that he can't even understand what he is saying. So the person that's talking to him is going to ask him a couple questions, and he'll respond effortlessly with a bunch of words, but it's clear that it did not register with him what was said.
Hi, Byron. How are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck, for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was really good and happy. And I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We save a lot of hands on hold for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talk of any more to saying?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope the world lasts for you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
I hope the world lasts for you. I thought that was an interesting thing to say. Okay. Now, this next one is going to be, this is affecting a different part of the brain, and it manifests itself in a very different way. So in this one, comprehension remains intact, and you can see that this girl is comprehending things, but expression is incredibly difficult. It's very difficult for her to even get 1 or 2 words out.
So what's your name?
Scott. Oh, no. Sarah Scott.
That's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
I can't.
Oh. You're 19. 19.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what happened to you?
Stroke.
You had a stroke last year.
Yes.
And what happened? Can you remember what happened?
School and English class,
Okay.
and I book and I read it aloud, but I can't because stroke, and so I send and also it's the same as the same of kind of thing as you know,
Pins and needles.
yeah,
like pins
the
and
same, and also farmers, but
Yeah. Okay, so that goes on for a while, and a lot of other interesting stuff comes out of that conversation. But again, what I just want to, the only reason I'm showing you this, because again, this doesn't have anything to do with genetics, but it has to do with the fact that a deficiency, in this case an acquired deficiency in a part of the brain, has very tangible effects on a person's ability to communicate. And language, or genetics can feed into that. Right, so these are typically developing people who had an injury and lost some aspect of their ability to communicate. And so we want to ask the question now of what happens to language when development is not normal, when there's a genetic cause to the condition. Okay, so this is a diagram that shows from 25 days up to 9 months the development of the human brain. So it starts off as something that's almost completely unrecognizable. And then the pace is breakneck here of changing from basically a bundle of cells into a fully formed brain. And so you can think of it as an intricate construction project that's on a really tight schedule, and hundreds of different cell types are constantly looking up the genome to figure out what they should be doing in that moment, right? So there's this whole program that they're constantly trying to figure out, and I got to connect to this bunch of neurons, and I got to send out a connection over here and do all these things. And the thing that I was thinking about is it's kind of like, imagine you're doing a report, or you're doing something really important where you're constantly referring to the internet. And I don't know if you've ever been in this case, but I've been in this case where a site that I've really depended on, and I'm working under a deadline, and suddenly the site's offline, and I really need it, and I kind of panic. Well, that's not a really big deal if the site that you're looking up is fluffykittensridingtricycles.com. So if you get a 404 error, which is a page not found, and you're trying to do something really important, that's not a big deal if that thing's missing. It's the same thing with genes. There are some genes that under certain circumstances are really not a big deal if they're MIA, right? But if you were to go to Google and you really needed to look something up and Google gave you a 404 error, then you'd be in big trouble. And it's the same thing with genes. And so we're going to give an example of a gene that's very important for development that had one of these 404 errors during the development of a family. and what happens there to language.
In 1996, researchers were studying 3 generations of one family. 16 of them had a severe speech disorder.
We've got like brain tests, mercury tests, go to the hospitals to have like brain scan.
Go to the hospital to have my brain scanned is what he was saying. And so that was him, and he was quite severely affected. I'm going to show you another video now that's years later, after he'd had a lot of attention, a lot of therapy, and you'll see that while it's still definitely language impairment, he can articulate himself much more clearly.
Hello people, today I'm going to talk about 5 things about me. 5 things about me. Let me think. Number 1, I have a rare speech disorder called Fox PH2. If you want to know more information about that, you can. Go to Google on the KE family. I'm famous in the medical history.
I'm famous in the medical history.
Number 2, I have a learning disability, but I can learn how to sort good things out from that.
Okay, so this up here is and my laser pointer just died on me, but the pedigree of this family, because they're talking about 3 generations, right, is right here. And everybody who is a black square or black circle is somebody who's affected by this language disorder. And through previous work, they had figured out that whatever was going on was something that was on chromosome 7. And so they did some work where so here in this column vector right here, all the pink spots would be people who are affected by the language disorder, and the white ones would be people who are unaffected, okay? And so what they would do is they would genotype different parts of chromosome 7, or look at what DNA that person carried, what version of the DNA that person carried, and then they would line it up here to see if there's a strong correlation, like if everybody that has one kind of DNA has the condition, and everybody who doesn't have that kind of DNA doesn't have the condition. And so they kind of walk along chromosome 7 in search of something that really lines up. Okay, so they're getting a little bit closer, and bingo, they find a place on chromosome 7 where everybody who has that language disorder in the family shares the same DNA from chromosome 7. And they eventually found out that right in this region was a gene called FOXP2. And FOXP2, the mutation in this family was a single amino acid change in the protein sequence. And FOXP2 is what's called a transcription factor, and that's kind of a master regulatory gene that controls the expression of a lot of other genes, and it's really important in brain development and important in lung development as well. So you can imagine not having this conductor of the orchestra there while brain development is happening, and it's going to result in a brain that has some missed connections, and that's what explains the speech disorder. So similar studies have been done in the meantime with other genes that cause language problems when mutated. And one of the most successful areas has been dyslexia, because that is an incredibly well-defined trait, right? It's really quite simple to tease out in the clinic, and so they've had some luck identifying genes that underlie dyslexia. So what's our research angle? Well, the idea is similar, but we look for less severe impairment across a larger sample of unrelated individuals. And the assumption here is that language is polygenic. And what does polygenic mean? That means that we suspect that language is the cumulative effect of a lot of different genes. And it's not, FOXP2 is not the only language gene out there that you mutate and you get a language phenotype. And we also measure language quantitatively. And this has all been work done with a colleague of mine at the University of Iowa, Bruce Tomlin, who over the course of his career surveyed thousands of kids and collected DNA on a lot of them. So the idea is that kids take a language assessment, we get their DNA, and then we genotype that DNA on a microarray. Now, I put a handout on everybody's seat. I want you guys to pull out. It's got colorful shapes on it, and I just want you guys to kind of understand from the first-person perspective a little bit of what this language assessment would look like if you were to take it. All right, so the first one is the token test, and I want you to look at the at the pictures. And what you're going to do is you're just going to follow my instructions. I'm going to read something, and then you either mark something with an X, or you draw a line between two shapes, or you circle it. Okay? And what this does is this tests your language comprehension. It tests phonological memory of how long you're able to maintain in your mind the words that I said, so that you can kind of parse out the instructions and do it correctly. Okay, all right, I'm going to do number 1 now. You ready? This one's an easy one. Circle a red shape. Okay, circle a red shape. All right, so obviously you could do either one of those. Okay, we're going to go on to number 2 now. Draw a line from the blue square to the white circle. Okay, so that's the correct answer for that one. Number 3, mark the shape that is below a circle but not next to a square. Okay, that's the correct answer for that one. Number 4, circle the circles between 2 squares. Okay, so this one has 2 possible answers. You can do that, or you can do that. And then finally, draw a line from the white shape that is above the yellow circle to the green circle. Okay, and the correct answer for that one is that. Okay? So you might imagine that we do this in high school classes all the time to kind of screen for it, and some people perform okay, and some people don't get any wrong, and other people will miss a few. And that's just a test of, and that's a reflection of the natural language ability that exists in the population. Okay, so vocabulary assessment. Okay, I'm going to read you 10 things, and you just answer yes or no. Does hot air ascend? Do flowers wither in the spring? Is cursory brief? Do fingernails replenish? Are dictators hegemonic? Are caring people misanthropes? Are esoteric topics widely understood? Can fettered cows roam? Are polite children insolent? Are easy tasks arduous? Okay, if you want to check your work, that's the right answers for those ones. Okay, so the idea is that we would take tests that are kind of like this and we combine them into a quantitative language score, and the distribution of that would look something like that. And once we have these quantitative measures of language, then we look at the genotypes that we've done with the microarray to see if any genotype really shows a trend with the language. So you can see on the top, that one doesn't show any trend. There's no association there. But that box plot on the bottom, there's a clear trend in the genotype with the language ability. Another way to look at this is this. So if you were to take the language score that's quantitative again and sort it, so you have low to high here, and then you're looking at a genotype. Here's a non-associated locus where the color indicates the genotype. There's no association there. There's no trend, right? But here's what an associated locus might look like. Okay, you can see there that there is a trend. There is a correlation between the genotype and the language score. So we're looking for places in the genome that are like that. So this is what it looks like when you do this test about 1 million times. And across the genome, you find that most places are not associated, but there are a few places in the genome that are associated with language. Now, we don't want to rely only on the genetic association data. So this circle would represent like all the genes that we find from the genetic association test, which I showed you right there. But we think if we combine another kind of independent line of evidence, genes that are implicated by co-expression, I'll explain what that is in just a second, then the overlap of those two is going to give us some high confidence genes that are probably involved in language. So this matrix that I'm showing right here represents the expression of a single gene in over 16 different brain regions and across developmental time. So from preterm to adulthood. And this is the expression of one gene in the brain. And so the idea is that we want to take known language genes like FOXP2 that I mentioned to you before and find their expression pattern in the brain. And then we want to find genes that have a similar expression pattern. Now, what this is like, it's kind of like, have you guys ever used Google image search where you upload an image to try and track down where it came from or what other similar images are like? Well, there's this cool link that says find visually similar images, and we're doing basically exactly the same thing. We've got a picture of a gene expression profile, and we want to find similar gene expression profiles. And so we get a bunch of genes that have similar expression profiles to FOXP2 in the brain. And then we have the overlap, and the intersection of those two gives us about 200 candidate genes. And these genes are highly enriched for cell adhesion and synapse. And so these are genes that help neurons make connections with each other and to find each other in the first place. And so what these genes are doing is they're helping the brain to wire itself in a way that is optimal for language comprehension and language production. Now, we're going to move on to whole genome sequencing because there's an important limitation. And I just want to ask, am I dating myself by putting a picture up here? Do you guys know what this is? Okay, good. All right, everybody still knows what Wheel of Fortune is. Now, the reason I put this up is because when you do a SNP array, or when you do these GWAS tests, you're sampling the genome in a really sparse way. In a best case scenario, these have about 1 million positions of the genome on there, but there's about over 3 billion positions in the genome, so you're only getting 1/3000th of the genome. And so it's kind of like getting a Wheel of Fortune puzzle where you've just got this huge phrase that you have to figure out and there's one letter in there. Well, with whole genome sequencing, you get the whole Wheel of Fortune puzzle laid out there for you. And so you can make sense of a lot more of what's going on. And so that's what we're moving towards now, where what I showed you before was genotyping on microarrays. We're actually going to sequence the entire genome of about 800 people. And we're doing that so that we can get lots of different kinds of genetic variants, because it's not just single nucleotide changes that are important, but there's larger copy number changes where things are duplicated or they're deleted or they're rearranged in some other way. And we want to be able to find those too. And we get the whole frequency spectrum, because the things that are represented on those microarrays, they only put them on there. It only makes financial sense to put things on there that are quite likely in the human family to vary from one individual to another. But unfortunately, what that means is that it's quite unlikely that those SNPs have a large effect because they've been in the human family long enough to vary from one person to the next. And so it's important to get these rare variants, and whole genome sequencing can do that. So what we're doing right now is the first whole genome sequencing of this language disorder, and we just got the first 8 whole genomes on Thursday. And it was all I could do to not stop working on this talk and to analyze those, because I was really looking forward to those. But we're going to be sequencing 800 individuals in total. So to sum up, the point of all of this is that we want to come to a better understanding of the unique hardware that humans have to understand and produce language. Because when we can do that, then we can come up with better predictive genetic models. So Barry talked about models. And when we come up with better predictive models, then we don't have to wait for the kid to fail at language before we start intervening. But we can say, this child is at an increased risk to have language disorder XYZ, and we know that this intervention is going to help the specific deficits that this kid has, and so we're going to do that right now while he's 6 months old, you know? And it's better to anticipate and plan than to wait to fail, because you get better outcomes, okay? And that's where I'm going to end. I want to thank everybody that's in my lab and the grants that we have funding our work. And I'd like to thank the organizers. Again, I'm really glad to be here, and hopefully we'll be able to talk and connect after the talks. Thank you.